Oh, don't say pivot, don't say unprecedented, don't say pivot, don't say unprecedented. Hi, my name's Scott McArthur. I'm a professional speaker, former HR director and business vlogger. Like many people, I've had to reframe how I spend my personal and work time in the post-COVID world to make sure that I stay in business. Today, this is my studio where I produce virtual keynotes and pre-recorded programs like this. I believe we need a new narrative for wellness in our organisations, and I'm going to give you 3 key ideas about 3 new narratives that you can adopt. But before we do that, I'm going to ask you a question. Are you up for a little quiz? What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you jumbled up numbers. The numbers go from 1 to 50, and I want you to count as many as you can in order. So 1, 2, 3. See if you can spot the numbers and count them in order and just see what you can get to. Are you ready? 3, 2, 1, go. So how did you get on? If I let you know that the average when I do this is 9, that'll give you an idea of how you got on. Now I'd like to show you how this puzzle can be made a lot easier. Let's try the exercise again. 3, 2, 1, go. How far did you manage to get? Put that in the comments below, and if you're really good there might be a prize for the person who got the furthest. I might need to do a little lottery actually, but have a go. You'll remember from my introduction how I said I had to reframe my business in order to stay in work. I believe this is a special time, possibly a once in a lifetime opportunity for organisations to reframe how they think about the future of work, but specifically about wellness in their organisations. I call this an edge of next moment. It's a bit like that scene in Indiana Jones where Indy has to step into the unknown, into a chasm where the invisible bridge is, in order to get to the treasure. And I believe that's exactly where many people are just now with regards to wellness. They're on the edge of next, and they're terrified of taking this step that will deal with wellness in a way they've never done it before. I know uncertainty is difficult, and I know how many problems it gives people, whether at work or at home. I often seek help with these issues from the poets. I love poetry, and one of my favourite contemporary poets is called David Whyte, and he wrote this a few years ago, and I think it exemplifies the possibility that we have here. So this is by David Whyte, and it goes like this. Start close in. Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing, close in, the step you don't want to take. The step you don't want to take. I think that is not only beautiful, but it's generative, and it says if you're facing uncertainty, just make a little progress. You don't need to go the whole way, and I think that gives us great hope for implementing new narratives into organisations around the future of work and wellness. What would you do if faced with this circumstance? Imagine you'd gone to the doctor and you hadn't been feeling very well for a few days, you were feeling quite hot, quite uncomfortable, and you said to the doctor, please can you just give me a checkup to see how I'm doing. So she does that. She gives you a checkup. She takes your blood pressure, she takes some blood samples, etc, etc, and she sends you off and says, look, we'll get the test done tonight and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Now the next morning you go to work and you're still feeling a bit sort of hot and clammy, and you're sitting at your desk and the phone rings. It's the doctor's receptionist, and he says to you, the doctor has asked me to call you and she would like you to come in to the surgery urgently. I wonder if you could come in now, or at least today. How do you feel at that point? So you get up from your desk, you ask your boss, look, do you mind if I go to the doctor? The doctor would like to see me, and she says, yes, on you go. So off you go. You get to the doctor's surgery and you go in to see the doctor. Now, doctors being doctors, they're not famous for their bedside manner or their human interaction skills. She's pretty blunt with you. She says, look, there's a problem. And there's a problem, it seems, with your heart. There seems to be something pretty seriously wrong. And if I'm absolutely honest, it's quite often a life-threatening problem. How are you feeling now? Then she says, look, there are some more tests we need to do, but in the meantime, there's been some research done in the United States with this particular type of heart disease. And there is something you can do that could really reduce the chances of you dying from this disease. Now ask yourself, you've not heard what I'm going to say yet, but do you think you would change given the circumstances? Then she says, what you need to do is go on a radical vegan diet. Now this isn't a normal vegan diet, this is a green leaf vegan diet. Would you go on that diet to save your life? Have a think about it. Well, this is actually work that was done some time ago by, believe it or not, Bill Clinton's main physician, and they've looked at over 10,000 cases of individuals with this heart disease, and they were given that, they were all told that if they changed their diet they could significantly reduce the chances of them dying of this heart disease. So I wonder how many of you would have changed your diet. Are you thinking you would have changed your diet? Well, the evidence is, as published in this book, that only 1 in 9 of you would actually change your diet. This can be really quite discombobulating. You think, well, isn't it obvious? If I'm not well, I'll change my diet. But people don't. People don't like to change. And I often laugh when people say, well, that's an interesting observation. And I reflect back on years and years and years of working with companies on change programs, usually when we were putting in new technology. And, you know, people won't change their behaviour to save their life. What do you think they feel like when you put in a new SAP or wellness program? Not a chance. So how do I suggest you go about dealing with wellness in your organisation? I said earlier that I believe we were on the edge of next, and that many organisations are in that situation. I spent many years working with companies that were looking to, you know, create a future. And one of the most frequent questions they asked me was, look, how do we get people to change? And no matter how much experience you have in transformation programs, that's always a really difficult question. And in my experience, the key issue is people's uncertainty. Today though, Mother Nature has handed us an opportunity for change, and that is the COVID-19 pandemic. Now I know how serious the COVID pandemic is, and if it's affected you and your family, you have my sincere condolences, and I don't underplay how serious and how difficult it is. And it kind of puts a lot of this business stuff that we're doing into context, I think, don't you? Despite this, I believe that the pandemic gives us an opportunity to transform our organisations and change the way we deal with wellness like never before. People's familiarity with processes, culture and nostalgic beliefs about the organisation are often, in my experience, the reason why people don't want to change, like in the heart example. In a rather funny experience I had recently, I was sent a document by a friend of mine who happens to work in government in one of the big dark buildings in London, and he sent me a copy of a field guide, and it was field sabotage guidance here. And what this was actually from the CIA. And during the Cold War, the CIA basically weaponized HR. And in this manual, they were putting spies into industry in Russia, or the USSR as it was, to try to damage productivity, damage morale. And if you look at the things that are involved in this manual, it is quite funny. It includes hold a conference. It includes make sure you have multiple levels of checking. Quite funny, isn't it? Now, I include this because it's funny, but also there's a serious side to it. The CIA knew how to disrupt organisations in the USSR, and we haven't learned the lessons from that. We haven't learnt that we really don't need to make things as complex as we've made them. Today, we are starting to see changes. And those changes, largely born of people working from home, are significant. People are having to change. Now, I appreciate that some people are really enjoying working from home, and there's even some suggestion in some early research that it's had a benefit for productivity. However, I think that future research will show that the working from home culture is not the solution to true productivity nor to wellness, because I believe that working from home, the isolation of working from home, is not only not good for you personally, mentally, but it's also not very good for organisational creativity and innovation. How do I suggest you reframe the situation? As I said earlier, I've got 3 things I want to discuss with you that I think can really impact how successful your organisation could be with wellness in the future. The first of those began when I was a young man. I was born in a place in central Scotland called Lanark. Now, Lanark is famous for 3 things. It's famous for its Lanimers Festival. It's famous for its role in the Jacobite Rebellion and how William Wallace started to move south with his army through Lanark. And finally, it's famous for a place called New Lanark. Now, like places in the rest of the UK like the Bourneville Village, this is where they started to consider working differently and started to think about if at the turn of the 19th century, could we make people happier at work? Could we make them well at work and get better productivity? Now, I'm sure the people who ran New Lanark had good intentions, and I'm sure they set out with those good intentions, but they were also business people, and they knew that by creating a cooperative environment supported by schools and exercise and education, that their profits would be higher. Ever since then, organisations across the world have used that structure. It's called scalable efficiency, and ever since the 1900s, it's been used as the foundation for nearly all of our larger organisations. However, early in the 20th century, the model of scalable efficiency started to show some issues. And indeed, in the 1950s, an economist called Cecil Parkinson, in an article, which was quite a funny article that he wrote for The Economist, said the following: work expands to fill the time allotted. This is now known as Parkinson's law, and put simply, it states the following: that the amount of work expands depending on the amount of time allotted for it to be done. And I'm sure you've seen that in projects where you may have 2 weeks to do a project and you only do it in the final few hours, or when you were doing your exams you had allotted 3 weeks study and you only did an hour before each exam. We seem to have this ability to stretch projects if we're allowed to, and add more resources to them even if they don't need them. There is also a thought-provoking version of Parkinson's law about computing that says that data expands to fill the storage available. That's a fascinating thing to dwell on, but maybe the topic for a different speech. Let me put this into context for you. I recently had the privilege of seeing Warren Buffett speaking at a conference. It was only a couple of years ago. He was an okay speaker. He was quite droll, quite serious, but at the end of the conference, at the end of the speech rather, someone in the audience said to him, they said, "Look, Warren, if there was one thing you could say, if there was one piece of advice that you could give people in organisations to make it better, what would it be?" And Warren, in his droll style, stepped forward and looked at the whole audience. There must have been about 100 people there that day, and he said, "It's really simple. It's this. It's people checking people, checking people. Now that was actually quite funny for me, because it was almost what I call a threshold moment, because it really changed my thinking. And it was funny because the next day I was actually speaking at the UK Association for Auditors, and guess what they do for a living? They're people who check people checking people. Even before COVID, we had an explosion of information and technology. As a consequence of this explosion of information, and the fact that many people's phones and smartphones were keeping them tethered to their employers 24 hours a day, there was a great feeling amongst many people of anxiety. People's wellness was being damaged by the proliferation of data. In an article recently published by The Atlantic, they went as far as to call the situation hyper-employment. I was doing a speech recently, and I actually worked with an illustrator to create this monster here, and this is called the chronophage. And this demonstrates just how much data is coming at us from all the social platforms. People just cannot cope in an environment that consumes so much of their personal time. Sorry, be right back. I've got to go and make a sales call. Many businesses are, in fact, maybe unwittingly, but they are creating an economy based on surveillance. And these things, Fitbits and Apple Watches, are increasingly being used to remind people what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. And I do wonder if that's a positive step. I believe we need a solution for this overwhelmed employee. We need to do something to help this and to stop this from happening. Things haven't really improved during the pandemic. And just this week, in this article, Silke Carlo, director of the anti-surveillance charity Big Brother Watch, said, "It's important for people's sense of autonomy and dignity and their mental health that the home remains a private space and we don't go down the route of this really invasive, constant monitoring of people's homes." Getting bored of this now. I know this will be difficult for many of us watching this, because you just love your human capital, don't you? Bearing in mind what Buffett taught us, I believe that the best way to deal with this is for leaders and organisations and individuals to adopt what I call radical simplicity. Common workplace processes and procedure have become overblown, and indeed many people are asking questions and scratching their head because they seem to be able to do their job perfectly well in much shorter time without the interruptions that they had in the office. Parkinson may have got this right. People quite simply spend far too much time in meetings and other activities like performance management and recruiting that demonstrably do not add value either to them as human beings or to the organisations. Now, in the context of radical simplicity, I've been lucky enough to work on a couple of Olympic Games and worked on many transformation programs in some very large companies, including Virgin and Apple and Coca-Cola. And one of the things that I instilled into them was this idea of radical simplicity. And I'm going to share with you one of the tools that we use, because sometimes you still, although I'm saying in this talk that I think we need to cut down the amount of data that we have, and we need to cut down the human capital that we measure, etc. I still think we need to be together. We have to create cohesive opportunities within our projects to make them work. So this is a very simple technique, and it'll make some of you laugh, I'm sure. You know, a former consultant, it's got to draw one 4-box model, and I'm going to draw a 4-box model. So let me do that and just talk you through it. So here we are. So every morning, whether it was in the Olympics or working in a fish factory in the north of Scotland, this is what we used to do. We would meet in the morning, and we would have one of these on the board. And my mentor at the time called this the ABCD model. It's not copyrighted, but it would be the A, B, C, D. Now, what these meant was, what each of these letters meant was this. A was for activities. B was for benefits. C was for concerns. And D was for do next. And we also used to draw 2 additional columns, which was basically little person here and a clock face here, which I'll come back to in a minute. So every morning we would come into the office with mainly the senior team, but quite often the specialists involved in the particular areas where we're working in that day, and we'd ask them, okay, what are we doing today? What activities are we focusing on today? So we'd record those. And we did this on a very simple spreadsheet. I mean, this was literally, you know, easy peasy recording, wasn't any complexity about it at all. So what are the activities? But then, of course, we would all collectively ask them, what are the benefits? You know, why are you doing this? Now, this obviously gets easier as you do it a few times, but then we write down the benefits. Now, if any of those benefits weren't very good, or there were worries about them, we'd record the concerns. So there was a direct relationship between benefits and concerns, which is quite useful, and also fed into our project plans, our risk registers, etc. So it was quite neat. Then what we did was we said, okay, given that we've agreed what we're going to do, what the benefits are, what some of the issues are to make sure we get these benefits, let's work out what we're going to do next. And then after that, and this is the bit that many companies forget to do, they forget to put names and time scales against those various benefits. Now, putting in place radical simplicity is something that I think presents great opportunities for companies. And let me tell you just one other little story about it, because I do believe in it, and I think it's something that we can grasp into and really improve levels of meaning and wellness in our organisations. One of the key things that I think needs thinking about is how we recognise leadership. Now, all too often at the moment, we still have these heroic leaders. They're like superheroes, the Steve Jobs of this world, who are very dominant, very powerful, and very demanding of their organisations. I would like that metaphor to change, and I'll tell you what I think it should be after this little story. I spent 18 months of my career working with the Navy, specifically with the individuals responsible for the Astute submarine. This is a hugely complex project involving multiple billions of pounds, and I was very keen to help the head of the Navy, who was the descendant of Samuel Pepys, the third Sea Lord, to get it right. And one of the projects, and one of the parts of the project that I got involved in, I used the ABCD model that I've discussed with you already. But then we got down to the nitty-gritty, and we were starting to talk about, okay, what's the point? What's the purpose of the Astute submarine? Now, if I'm honest, they weren't that clear. I mean, they gave the examples that you would perhaps expect, you know, we're a deterrent, blah blah blah. But it wasn't enough. You couldn't use that particularly publicly. And of course, with nuclear weapons, you have a lot to say to the public about their value and why we use them. And I'll keep my personal thoughts on that to myself. But we challenged them, and it didn't come across as clear. So I suggested that we bring in some other individuals, not from within the Navy, to help them define what their purpose was. We brought in people from the general MOD, we brought them in from government, we brought them in from suppliers, we brought them in from public interest groups, and we set up a working group to look at this, to think about how they could actually define what they do in a way where the public, whilst not particularly liking nuclear weapons, could understand why the United Kingdom has them. I then left that project and I was working in a retail environment after that with Marks and Spencer's, and I got a letter. It was actually a proper letter. It was typed, but it was a proper A4 piece of paper, which is very rare these days. But I got a letter and it was from the chap who I had been working directly with in the Navy, and he said, "Scott, I just wanted to let you know that the simple idea that you had about taking away lots of our complexity has really helped, and the meetings have gone really, really well, and we've come up with something that we think explains what we do." Now, this turns out to be a picture, because as you probably guessed from my presentation, I like pictures. I like using pictures, developing pictures, and trying to get people to see things visually as well as being able to talk about them verbally. And this is the picture. Now, I have to say, this is one of the most significant experiences in my career, because whilst he's obviously not a very good artist, I certainly hope he's a better submariner than he is an artist. The purpose of the astute submarine is to protect the world via the balance of law. And I think that's an incredibly powerful picture. And I love the fact that he drew his hands on there. That was his personal responsibility for keeping the world safe. Now, I promised you a new metaphor, a generative metaphor for leadership in the COVID and post-COVID world. And the metaphor I'd like you to think about is this: leadership as a gardener. Now, I'm not claiming to have come up with this idea, but I was personally inspired by an article that I read in Forbes a few years ago. And in that article, Jürgen Appello said, managers should manage the system, not the people. Now, given the discussion we've already had about how hard it is to change people's behaviours, they won't even change if their life depends on it, this is really interesting. Being a biologist from my background, the idea of managing the environment is a very powerful one, as one of the classic equations in biology is genotypes, that's your DNA, your nature if you like, plus environment, that's pretty obvious, equals phenotype, that's how you are expressed. So environment is very, very important, and I think it's the overlooked secret in much of the wellness community and in people who are trying to do transformation programs today. So what I'd like to invite you to do is to think of your organisation as a garden. Now, most gardens, not them all, but most gardens have a purpose. Now, my garden here, where I live in the Cotswolds near Stratford-upon-Avon, has got what they call raised beds in it, and I've got soft fruit in one, I've got vegetables in another, I've got potatoes in another, and then I've got rhubarb and bits and pieces in the other one. Each part of the garden has a purpose. The other thing you'll know if you're a gardener is that each plant needs different environments. So some of the plants are happy grouped together, like chives. Other plants have to be further apart from one another, like many of the large cabbages and stuff like that. I'm not an expert. But other parts of the garden, like some other plants need a lot of sunshine. Other plants will quite happily grow in the shade. But together, all of those plants form the purpose of that garden. Now, the gardener has a role to look after each one of those plants, giving them the requirements that their particular type requires. Perhaps the most important thing for a gardener is to make sure that he or she thinks about the soil, because the soil is the environment in which all the plants grow. The soil is something that I'm learning about just now in my garden. You know, you need to think about it all through the year, because if you don't get good plants. The soil's a bit like the culture of a company. If you don't get the soil right, the plants just won't grow. The other thing about plants is the gardener can't tell them what to do. You know, sometimes you'll plant something and it just won't grow. Other times you plant something and it grows ridiculously. And the art of a gardener is knowing about the individual plant and how to nurture that plant. Imagine that as a leader, nurturing people that you work with, not command and control, grow faster. Doesn't work. I think this metaphor for leadership sits beautifully with the rest of this presentation, because what it does is it suggests that you have to remove impediments for things growing. You have to remove things from the soil that are not positive for the plants. You've got to add ingredients to the soil to help the plants grow. But you can't do a one-size-fits-all approach. That just doesn't work. The plants are different. You have to think about each plant as a unique individual, and only then will they come together to form your flourishing garden. I think that's exactly the same as the contemporary workplace, where leaders are more and more trying to manage in complex, very complex environments. So how are you at gardening? The second thing I want to talk to you about focuses very much on how people experience wellness at work. And I'm going to talk about how organisations create meaning in the workplace. This really came into sharp focus for me when I did a TEDx talk a few years ago. But before I go into that, I'm going to ask you to come back in time with me. Back in time so far, indeed, it's nearly 2,500 years. I'm going to tell you about a parable that I think gets across the importance of the point I'm going to share with you quite beautifully. Now, to do this, I'm going to turn to my artifact wall. These are all my stories that I tell when I'm speaking, and indeed I'm going to use one of them now. And today I'm going to use this. Now, 2,500 years ago, there was a village. That village was probably somewhere in Asia. There's many accounts of this story, but I think most of them agree that it was somewhere in Asia. And this village was unusual for one reason. Everyone in the village was blind. So this thing came into the village, and the children ran to the elders and said, "There's something here, we don't know what it is, can you come and see it?" So the elders come out to see what has come into the village. The first one comes to this end, and he reaches up and he feels something long with a sort of tassely bit at the end. He thinks, "Oh, I don't know what that could be. Is it a brush?" The second one steps up here and he puts his arms around it and he feels it's round, cylindrical, it's high, it's tall, and he thinks, "Oh, I think it's a tree." The third one comes here and he reaches up and he feels this tall, really hard surface and he thinks it must be a wall. And the final one comes to here and she reaches up and she feels a smooth, pointy structure that feels like stone, and she thinks, "I think that might be a spear." Despite that being a 2,500-year-old parable, I think it has much in it to commend it to the contemporary audience. None of the elders could see the whole thing. None of the elders could see that this was an elephant. They could only see where they were touching it and where they were experiencing it. And I see that in organisations all the time. You've probably, there's things like, people are working in stovepipes or working in their own little areas where they've got walls around them and they don't come out. I think that's a really important parable because it suggests that in these difficult times, when many people are working from home, they've got even less time to understand what the whole organisation is like. And if people don't really know what they're trying to do, or what they're trying to commit to, or what they're trying to contribute to, more importantly, that's not good for a well-meaning, because they don't know what their purpose is. They're not sure what the bigger picture is. So I'll just put this elephant back where it should be. So back to my TEDx experience in Warwick. Do you know, it was a great day, and there was 17 of us presenting to about 2,500 people. It was one of the biggest ones in Europe. And it was great, but the experience that really I remember isn't the red dot. It's actually what happened that evening. Being one of the bigger TEDx's, they had some budget to take all the speakers out for dinner with their partners that evening, and they took us to a rather nice restaurant in Warwick. So we all sat down and we were in little tables of maybe 6, and we started to talk about the day. And very, very quickly I was getting feedback on my talk from an opera singer, from a sex therapist, from a nanobot expert. I even got feedback from a person who's working in nanobots that look at curing cancer. I realised quite quickly that this was something special. I was getting something that I had never had in a corporate environment. I was getting feedback from people that were nothing like me. They had no idea about my subject and I had no idea about theirs. But we were all smart and we were all able to give each other honest feedback on what the experience had been of giving a talk that day. These days, this is called having cognitive diversity in your environment. Having people who are completely different, looking at your whether it's your presentation or your document or your bid, whatever it is you're involved in, having people that are not like you look at the document lifts the veil and people start to see things that you might not necessarily have seen. Now, I put this into action at a very large European IT company. I was working with the sales force, and I was working with the top 10 people in the sales force, and I was just teaching them some basic pitching course so they could pitch to win work. And but what I told them was there'd be 2 days of training, and then the third day we would have a dragon's den. Now at that dragon's den there would be me, there'd be the chief executive, and there'd be some special guests. So these were good, diligent people, very intelligent. They went off and they created their pitches for the particular IT solutions that they were responsible for selling. When they walked into the room, they saw me, they saw the chief executive, and they saw their kids and their partners. Now, you've never seen so many grown adults go white suddenly. It was very, very funny, and we had a good giggle at it. But the magic happened when they started to speak. They were presenting, they were using their pre-prepared speech, they were pre-prepared slides, and hands kept going up saying, "Daddy, what do you mean by that? What does that acronym mean? What does that word mean? What do you mean by value? What do you mean by strategy? What do you mean by technology even?" That day, I don't think I've ever had such good feedback from an event ever. Cognitive diversity, getting different people into your organisation to help you do your job, is an extraordinary thing, and it really helps everybody understand how to communicate with people who are not looking at the same part of the elephant. And one of the things that some companies are suffering from, and it might be yours, is that they can't now look for external resources like business consultants and other advisors. This is a big problem for some companies, and I know certain parts of the public sector are really struggling with it in particular. So what I decided to do was to say to people, okay, let's take the principle of cognitive diversity. Let's look at the people who are saying, look, I can do my job in a shorter amount of time because I'm working from home. Let's give them other responsibilities. Now, I've worked in companies that have said, oh, we have multifunctional teams, we have multifunctional project teams. That was never real. They were, you know, getting guys working from marketing with HR and HR with finance, that's not multidisciplinary thinking. That's not cognitive diversity. So what I help them do is to build consulting skills internally, and they form what I call rapid action teams. And these teams are hierarchy independent, and they can go in, look at a problem, see the elephant as it really is, and add genuine value to the organisation. And you know what? The people doing this work feel better about their work, and they get more meaning from their work, and therefore their levels of engagement and the levels of enjoyment, employee experience and wellness also improve. So the third and final thing I want to talk to you about is probably the simplest one. But I believe, the best till last, because I think this topic can radically change the environment, can radically change levels of wellness in the workplace. This is something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I was working on it before COVID, but I think now it's even more important. You see, I believe there's a toxin in our organisations, and that toxin has grown over the last 30 years more than it ever has before in human history. And that toxin is KPIs, key performance indicators. Now that might surprise you, because I said earlier that I used to be a scientist, but I believe measurement is critically important. I believe that evidence is critically important. But I think we've gone too far with the way we measure things at work. We're restricting people with data. We're restricting them with measurement. The stories I've heard would turn your hair grey, of people having to work really hard just to meet hour on hour KPIs. Quite frankly, it's ridiculous and highly damaging to people's wellness at work. So I believe that organisations who look for the first time at removing measurement could be the ones that create the most welcoming and sustainable environments for their people to work in, with the employee experience being improved significantly. But I tell you what, I'm not just going to say something and not give you something to think about, not something to hang on this. So I'm going to give you a KPI, but this is a different type of KPI. I believe this KPI is so powerful that I call it the golden KPI. And that KPI is this: it's time well spent. I know personally, and I've heard from lots of my friends and lots of my colleagues and clients, they are much more aware of how short time is in 2020 than they ever were in the past. That is something that I think, if you think about it, is a meeting time well spent, is a process time well spent, is a bid process time well spent. And if things aren't time well spent, including watching this video, then don't watch it. The average human lives for 28,000 days. You sleep for a third of that. Then if you take off things like shopping and gardening and playing on the internet, etc., you're left with 6,000 days between home and work. Your days are precious, And I think companies that respect that will get respect back from their people. They'll feel trusted and they will feel welcome and important in that organisation. So let's embed thinking around the golden KPI, time well spent. Now, as David Attenborough said just yesterday about the planet and how he believes that saving the planet is now a matter of communications, it's a communications challenge. I think what I've spoken about today is also about communication. It's about getting closer to people. It's about understanding what they need. And it's not falling into the historical traps that I mentioned on the first point. So let me summarise very briefly what I've talked about today. I started by describing the context that we're currently living in, and I believe that context, whilst tragic, presents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to challenge things that have been embedded in companies for decades. We then looked at Warren Buffett's idea of the biggest problem in organisations being people checking people. And I talked about how people are going more and more towards surveillance rather than backing off. And I would love to see companies back off with the surveillance. Trust your people, they'll trust you back, and that will increase wellness. Secondly, I introduced you to the parable of the elephant, and we talked about cognitive diversity. And that's about how people understand what part in the company they play. It's about creating meaning in the workplace by including people in things that they would not normally historically have been involved in. And then finally, the most important one in my opinion, the third one, was the golden KPI. Make sure that everything we do in the workplace, everything your people do in the workplace, is time well spent. That will improve the employee experience and build your wellness strategy and take your organisation in a positive direction. Well, that's about it from me. I hope you found this interesting. I've enjoyed presenting it to you. Here's a little bonus piece for you. There's also a lot of evidence that suggests that getting out in nature is a jolly good thing to be doing as well. So in these difficult times, I think organisations can even think about things like that. So thank you very much for listening.